At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the pen in Daniel Whitaker's hand hovered just a few millimeters above the paper that could quietly erase 30 years of his life. The document waiting beneath his trembling fingers looked ordinary, just another legal form printed in black ink on white paper, on white paper. But the numbers buried inside it carried the weight of everything he had ever built. One careless signature would finalize a financial collapse that had been stalking him for months. Bankruptcy. The word itself felt like a slow thunder rolling through his chest. The lobby around him was calm and polished, the kind of quiet corporate building where the floors gleamed and every step echoed softly. Morning sunlight streamed through tall glass windows and stretched across the marble floor like pale gold ribbons. People walked past in suits, checking phones and sipping coffee, completely unaware that a man sitting at a small round table near the cafe corner was seconds away from losing everything. Daniel had barely slept. The dark circles under his eyes told a story of nights spent staring at spreadsheets, debt notices, and threatening emails from lenders. His once successful construction company had been battered by a storm of delayed payments, rising material costs, and one catastrophic project failure that drained nearly every dollar he had. For months he had fought to keep the business alive, selling equipment, refinancing property, even dipping into the college funds he had saved for his 2 daughters. But today felt like the final chapter. Across the table sat a simple breakfast, untouched toast and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The pen in his hand felt heavier than it should, as if it understood the gravity of the moment. If this story of struggle, resilience, and unexpected kindness means something to you, take a moment right now to like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the smallest moments can change a life forever. Daniel lowered his eyes to the document again. The legal language blurred slightly as exhaustion pressed against his vision. His lawyer had explained it clearly the night before. Sign the papers, file them immediately, and the bankruptcy process would begin. Painful, humiliating, but necessary. He had agreed. What he didn't expect was how impossible the act of signing would feel. The pen tip finally touched the page. And that was when someone noticed. Not a lawyer, not a banker, not anyone who understood corporate contracts or financial restructuring. It was a waitress. Her name was Emily Carter, a young woman who had been working the morning shift at the cafe tucked into the building's lobby. She wore a light blue uniform with a white apron and carried a glass coffee pot that caught the sunlight as she walked between tables. Emily had the quiet observational habits of someone who spent hours serving strangers. She noticed things people thought no one saw: the shaking hands of a nervous customer, the tired slump of someone who hadn't slept, the subtle tension in a room. Daniel's table had caught her attention almost immediately, not because he looked wealthy or important, but because he looked like a man carrying the weight of an entire world. His suit was expensive but slightly wrinkled, his hair gray at the temples, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. And now he was staring at a document with the kind of stillness that made Emily pause mid-step. She approached gently, offering to refill his coffee. As she leaned slightly to pour, her eyes briefly drifted across the paper. She wasn't trying to read it, but one line caught her attention immediately. Modest numbers had always been easy for Emily. She had once dreamed of studying accounting, but life had pushed her toward working long hours instead. Even so, the structure of financial documents still felt familiar to her, and something on that page looked wrong. The figure printed in bold near the bottom seemed unusually large compared to the rest of the calculations above it. She blinked and looked again. Then her stomach tightened. The number appeared to be a total liability amount, but it looked like an extra zero had slipped into the sum. At first she thought she must be mistaken, but as Daniel lifted the pen again, ready to sign, instinct pushed her to speak. Emily hesitated, her heart beating faster. Interrupting someone's legal business was not exactly part of her job description, but something about the moment felt urgent. She gently mentioned that the number looked strange. Daniel barely reacted at first. His mind was already exhausted from weeks of reviewing financial statements. Mistakes had happened before, but this document had been prepared by professionals. Still, the quiet certainty in Emily's voice made him pause. For the first time that morning, he looked carefully at the line she had pointed out. And suddenly the fog in his brain cleared. The total liability number listed in the document was nearly 10 times higher than it should have been. At first he thought he was misreading it, but then he traced the numbers upward through the calculations. And there it was. One simple mistake. One misplaced digit, an extra zero, had been inserted into a line item during the document preparation process, multiplying the final liability figure dramatically. The difference wasn't small. It was catastrophic. The incorrect number made it appear that Daniel's debts exceeded his assets by millions more than they actually did. Signing the document as written would lock him into a bankruptcy that might not even be necessary. Daniel's chest tightened as adrenaline surged through him. For weeks he had been drowning in stress and exhaustion. He had trusted the final paperwork because he assumed every number had already been verified. But now, staring at the document again with fresh eyes, he saw it clearly. The numbers were wrong. Very wrong. His hands began to shake, not with despair this time, but with disbelief. The room around him suddenly felt sharper, brighter. The sunlight, the footsteps, the soft clinking of cups in the cafe, everything came back into focus. He realized how close he had come to ending his company, his reputation, and the livelihoods of dozens of employees because of a single unnoticed error. And the only reason he had caught it was because a waitress refilling coffee had trusted her instinct enough to speak. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, his heart pounding. 30 years of work had almost vanished in the space of one careless calculation. He spent the next several minutes carefully rechecking every figure on the document, while Emily quietly returned to the counter, unsure whether she had helped or simply interfered. When Daniel finally looked up again, his eyes were no longer clouded with defeat. They were alive with determination. He immediately called his lawyer and requested a full review of the paperwork. Within an hour, the mistake was confirmed. The error had occurred during a rushed revision the previous night when financial figures were being reformatted. Correcting the number changed everything. Instead of being hopelessly buried in debt, Daniel's company still had a narrow but real path to survival. It wouldn't be easy. There would still be negotiations, restructuring, and months of hard decisions. But bankruptcy was no longer inevitable. And that changed the entire future of the business. As the morning continued, Daniel sat quietly in the cafe, staring at the document that had almost rewritten his life. He thought about the years he had spent building his company from a tiny two-person operation into a respected construction firm, employing dozens of workers. He thought about the families who depended on those jobs. And he thought about the strange twist of fate that had placed a sharp-eyed waitress beside his table at exactly the right moment. Later that morning, before leaving the building, Daniel approached the cafe counter. Emily looked slightly nervous when she saw him coming, but instead of frustration or annoyance, Daniel's expression carried something much deeper. Gratitude. He thanked her for speaking up when it would have been easier to stay silent. He explained how close he had come to making a decision that could have destroyed everything he had worked for. Emily listened quietly, her eyes widening as she understood the full weight of what had happened. Sometimes life-changing moments don't arrive with loud warnings or dramatic alarms. Sometimes they arrive as a quiet observation from someone who simply cares enough to pay attention. Daniel left the building that day not as a man who had lost everything, but as someone who had been given a second chance. One he never expected to receive. Over the following months, he fought harder than ever to rebuild his company's stability. Contracts were renegotiated. Projects were completed. Slowly, the financial pressure began to ease, and through it all, he never forgot the moment when everything could have ended. So before this story reaches its final moments, here's a special request for you. If you've ever experienced a moment where a stranger's kindness changed your life, write the word "a kindness" in the comments below, because sometimes the smallest actions carry the greatest impact. A year later, Daniel returned to the same building lobby on a bright morning that looked remarkably similar to the day his life almost collapsed. But this time, he wasn't carrying bankruptcy documents. He was carrying something else. Opportunity. Daniel had created a scholarship program for working students pursuing business and finance degrees, something he wished had existed when he was younger. And the very first recipient was Emily Carter. The young waitress who once poured coffee while quietly noticing a mistake had now been given the chance to pursue the accounting education she once dreamed about. Moments like that remind us how fragile and beautiful life can be. One observation, one decision, one decision. One act of courage from someone who believes their voice matters. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how powerful kindness can be. Because sometimes the difference between losing everything and finding hope again is simply one person who decides to pay attention. The following morning, Daniel Whitaker woke up before the alarm even had the chance to ring. For a moment, he lay still in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling as if trying to confirm that yesterday had really happened. The memory returned slowly, like sunlight creeping through curtains, the pen hovering over the page, the crushing weight of defeat, and then the unexpected interruption that had changed everything. Just 24 hours earlier, he had walked into that building convinced he was about to sign away the last piece of the company he had spent 3 decades building. Now the document sat on his kitchen table with red correction marks all over it, proof that one tiny mistake had nearly destroyed his life. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly. He had been so tired, so buried under pressure, that he almost stopped questioning things. That realization scared him more than the bankruptcy itself. The world outside his window was waking up. Cars passed on the street below, and the early light of morning painted soft gold across the walls of his apartment. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and the normal rhythm of life carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. But Daniel knew something had changed, not just in his business, in him. For months he had been fighting purely out of fear of losing the company, fear of disappointing his employees, fear of admitting failure to his daughters. Every decision had come from desperation. Yet the moment Emily had pointed out the error on that document, something inside him shifted. It was as if a fog had lifted, reminding him that problems weren't always walls. Sometimes they were puzzles that still had solutions waiting to be discovered. Daniel arrived at his office earlier than anyone else that day. The building that housed Whitaker Construction stood on the edge of the industrial district, a modest brick structure that had been his second home for years. When he unlocked the front door, the quiet inside felt both comforting and heavy. This place held thousands of memories. Late nights with blueprints spread across conference tables. The first time he had hired 10 employees instead of 2, the day they landed their biggest contract. And recently, the painful months of layoffs, budget cuts, and financial stress. But now there was something new in the air, a fragile but undeniable possibility. He spent the entire morning reviewing every financial document again, this time slowly and carefully. Without the massive error in the bankruptcy paperwork, the company's situation looked different. Still difficult, still risky, but not hopeless. There were ways forward. Daniel began making calls. First to his lawyer to correct the filing documents, then to a lender who had previously refused to renegotiate a loan, then to 2 clients whose delayed payments had caused the worst strain on his cash flow. One conversation led to another, and gradually the pieces began to shift. None of it felt like a miracle. It was still hard work, difficult negotiation, and careful planning. But the difference was simple and powerful. Daniel was no longer trying to survive the end. He was rebuilding a future. All day long, however, one thought kept returning to him. The image of the young waitress standing beside his table with a coffee pot in her hand. Emily Carter. Someone who had absolutely no reason to involve herself in a stranger's business decision. Someone who could have easily ignored what she noticed. But she hadn't. By the afternoon, Daniel knew he couldn't just move forward without acknowledging that moment properly. So the next morning at exactly the same time, 8 o'clock sharp, he walked back into the same glass-walled building lobby. The sunlight was almost identical to the day before, streaming across the marble floors and reflecting softly off the tall wooden panels along the walls. Business professionals passed through the space in a hurry, phones in hand, coffee cups steaming, and tucked into the corner, just like always, was the small cafe. Emily stood behind the counter arranging cups when she noticed him. At first she looked slightly nervous again, unsure why he had returned. Daniel approached slowly, this time without any documents in his hands, only a calm expression. He thanked her again, but this time he explained the full story. After the mistake was corrected, the bankruptcy filing had been stopped entirely. The company still had challenges ahead, but it was no longer collapsing under false numbers. Emily listened quietly, surprised by how serious the situation had truly been. She admitted that when she mentioned the number, she almost stayed silent. It felt strange commenting on something that clearly looked like legal paperwork. But the numbers had simply felt wrong. Daniel smiled faintly at that. Sometimes instinct was more powerful than expertise. As they talked, Daniel learned a little more about her story. Emily had always been good with numbers. In high school, she had even won a regional math competition. Her dream had been to study accounting or finance, but family responsibilities and financial pressure forced her to start working immediately after graduation. The cafe job helped support her mother and younger brother. College had become something that lived quietly in the background of her life, a dream waiting for a better time. Daniel didn't say much at that moment. He simply nodded and thanked her once again before leaving. But the conversation stayed with him. Over the next several months, Whitaker Construction slowly began stabilizing. It wasn't easy. There were long nights, tense meetings, and many difficult decisions, yet the company survived. Contracts were renegotiated, costs were reduced, and gradually the financial pressure eased enough for the business to breathe again. And every once in a while, Daniel would remember that morning in the cafe, not as a near disaster anymore, but as the moment someone reminded him that small details matter, and that kindness often appears in unexpected places. About a year later, on another bright spring morning, Daniel returned to the same building once again. This time he carried a folder in his hand. Inside it was something very different from the document he had almost signed 12 months earlier. Instead of bankruptcy papers, the folder contained the official paperwork for a brand new scholarship program Daniel had created through his company. It was designed specifically for working students who wanted to study accounting, finance, or business management, students who had the talent but lacked the financial opportunity. And the very first scholarship had already been awarded. When Daniel stepped into the cafe, Emily was again behind the counter preparing the morning rush. She looked surprised when she saw him. Daniel greeted her warmly and handed her the folder. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then she saw the words printed across the first page. Whitaker Construction Future Finance Scholarship. Her name was listed as the first recipient. For a moment, she simply stared at the paper, her eyes wide with disbelief. The scholarship would cover tuition for her accounting degree while allowing her to continue working part-time. The opportunity she thought had slipped away forever was suddenly standing right in front of her. Daniel explained that the scholarship existed because of one simple moment, the moment she decided to speak up about a number that didn't feel right. Without that moment, his company might not exist anymore, and if the company survived, he believed the success should help someone else build their own future too. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she realized the full meaning of what had happened. One small act of awareness had created a ripple far bigger than either of them could have imagined. Before we reach the final moments of this story, here's something special I'd love to ask you. If you believe that small acts of kindness can change lives, write a second chance in the comments below, so others reading can see how powerful compassion can be. Because sometimes the biggest turning points in life don't come from grand gestures or dramatic events. Sometimes they begin with something as simple as noticing a detail and having the courage to mention it. And sometimes that small moment can rewrite an entire future. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in kindness and second chances, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us how powerful ordinary people can be. Because the truth is, the world changes quietly, one small act of courage at a time. Yellow Heart.